Hello AP students, this is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for Chapter 6, Learning, and today we're going to get into talking a little bit about observational learning, or insight learning, or cognitive psychology, and how that impacts perhaps maybe learning itself. So as we go along, make sure you have your handout and follow along and get the notes that you need. So we're going to talk a little bit about cognitive psychology. How does this explain learning? And according to the cognitive psychologist, learning basically are flashes of learning, or according to cognitive psychologists, are some form of learning that must be explained as changes in the mental process rather than changes in behavior alone. So as we previously talked a little bit about classical conditioning and operant conditioning, that is incredibly behavioralistic, not necessarily focusing on the mind itself. And cognitive psychologists, they want to pull in the fact that the mind is at play. Insight learning, talking about perhaps maybe learning through mental processing. And we're going to talk a little bit about a guy named Wolfgang Köhler, who, if you remember a while back, he is a Gestalt psychologist. We talked about him when we were talking about sensation and perception, but he was also involved in talking a little bit about insight learning. And his research showed that chimpanzees could solve simple or complex problems by combining simpler behaviors that they had previously learned separately. And one of Köhler's chimps was a chimp named Sultan. And he had piled up a whole bunch of boxes and had scrambled to the top of them to reach some fruit, particularly some bananas that had been suspended kind of high in his cage. And he used sticks to obtain these fruits. And all he had to do was just knock them down, and he was able to reach them and enjoy the fruit. Okay, Köhler came back and suspended the fruit even higher into the air, and one of the chimps attacked it, and unfortunately it was unsuccessful. In a trial and error fashion, Sultan eventually threw his sticks away and kicked the wall and sat down, very frustrated. Suddenly he jumped up, grabbed the box and a stick, put them underneath the fruit, climbed up onto the box, and knocked the fruit down with the stick. Sultan had never seen this behavior before, hadn't seen it done. But in a sense, he had learned, maybe through a little bit of trial and error, that there were ways to solve this problem, using some of the tools that were perhaps maybe in his cage. Humans, for the most part, we learn to solve problems by suddenly perceiving familiar objects in new forms or relationships, and decidedly mental processes rather than behavioral ones are at play. Insight learning is a form of cognitive learning originally described by the Gestalt psychologist, in which problem solving occurs by a means of sudden reorganization of perceptions. It's kind of like that aha moment, if you've ever heard of that. Cognitive maps. We're going to talk a little bit about Edward Tolman and the fact that he was coming up with this idea of using some type of mapping in our mind. So a cognitive map is a mental representation of a physical space. So if you've ever thought about the layout of maybe your house, or if I'm trying to make a list to go to the grocery store, maybe the layout of the store, so my list goes in the order of the layout of the grocery store, that's the kind of stuff that's at play here. Edward Tolman proposed this idea of the cognitive maps, and he did so by the following. Mental images, not behaviors. So a cognitive map was only to account for a rat quickly selecting an alternative route in a maze when the preferred path would perhaps be blocked. Learning was mental, not behavioral, and Tolman offered another experiment. And in this experiment, after the rats had run through this maze and kind of learned it, he eventually flooded the maze so that the rats, for the most part, couldn't use the same path. They could swim through it, but for the most part, he wanted them to be challenged. So instead of learning merely a sequence of right and left turns, Tolman argued that they had acquired a more abstract mental representation of the maze in a spatial layout. Learning without reinforcement. Tolman allowed his rats to just kind of wander freely through these mazes for hours, during which they received no reinforcement whatsoever. They could just wander. There was no food given to them. The rats were able to negotiate the maze for food, for a reward, more quickly than rats that had never seen the maze before, and hence we get into the concept of latent learning. The significance of Tolman's work. What made Tolman's work both significant and provocative was its challenge to the prevailing behavioral views of the masters, Pavlov, Watson, Skinner. Tolman accepted the idea that psychologists must study observable behavior. He also showed that simple associations between the stimuli and perhaps the responses cannot explain the behavior observed in some of his experiments. Tolman's cognitive explanation presented the challenge to behavioralists. And brain mapping has pointed to the hippocampus as a structure involved in drawing the cognitive map. So organisms learn the spatial layout of their environment by exploring, and then they do so even if they're not reinforced for the exploring. Observable learning. Albert Bandura and challenges to behavioralism. So, does observing violent behavior make a person violent? Albert Bandura thought so, and he came up with this wonderful experiment known as the Bobo experiment. And this, by the way, is a Bobo doll. After observing adults seemingly enjoying punching and hitting and kicking our good friend Bobo the plastic clown, children were later showed similar aggressive behaviors towards the doll. It kind of works like this. Children were put into a room with lots of toys to play with. Bobo was there, and these children were just enjoying themselves. And at some point in time, an adult walks into the room. They're kind of frustrated. They're kind of grumping. And they go over to Bobo, and they take their frustrations out on the Bobo doll. These little kids are observing this behavior. Okay, the children are removed from the room, and some of these wonderful toys that they had been playing with were also removed, except for Bobo. And so when the children came back, they were frustrated that the toys were gone, but Bobo was there. And what did these kids do? Well, they took their frustrations out on Bobo, hence observable learning. So these children were more aggressive than those in a control condition who had not observed the aggressive models. And children have a tendency to imitate aggressive behaviors that they have seen on film or on cartoons. By learning by observation and imitation, imitation can serve us in situations where we have not had a bad experience. If the model's actions appear successful, that is, if the model seems to find it reinforcing, they may seek to behave in the same way. Hence observational learning, or aka social learning, which is a form of cognitive learning in which new responses are acquired after watching others' behavior and the consequences of their behavior. This accounts for children learning aggressive behavior by imitating aggressive role models who perceived as being successful or admirable, or who seem to be enjoying themselves. And this may account for changes in clothing fashions, because maybe we see a role model wearing some new fashion and everybody wants to imitate them, or the rapid spread of slang expressions. The effects of media and violence. Observational learning has focused on the impact of violence in film and on video. There is correlational evidence from more than 50 studies that observing violence is associated with violent behavior, and more than 100 experiments point to this causal relationship. Noted social psychologist Elliot Aronson did some extensive research on this, and he looked at media violence as being an undoubtable factor in contributing to violent tragedies such as the Columbine shootings in our society. A lot of Aronson's research goes back to the late 1990s. Anyway, this capacity to learn from watching enables us to acquire behaviors efficiently without going through a new trial and error. Behavioral learning, kind of rethinking this, perhaps maybe in cognitive terms. Robert Rossola has shown that crucial features of conditioned stimulus is all about its informativeness, and that is the value in predicting the onset of the unconditioned stimulus. We can see this in food aversions, where certain tastes can serve as a warning for an illness. Leon Kamen in 1969 has shown that a learner will form kind of a conditioned stimulus conditioned response connection only if the conditioned stimulus seems to provide a unique information about the unconditioned stimulus. So in his laboratory, an inversion unconditioned stimulus, such as a shock, was preceded by multiple warning cues, such as lights and tones and taste, yet his animal subjects paid attention only to the stimulus that provided the best information about the unconditioned stimulus. You may see smoke as well as the smell of acrid odors of something burning before you actually see any kind of flames of a fire. But you may have learned from experience that smoke is not always visible during a fire, whereas the smell of something burning might be the telltale sign of a fire. Reinforcement changes not only the behavior, but the individual's expectation of future rewards and punishment. Brain mechanisms in learning. On a neural learning, apparently involves physical changes that strengthen the synapse in a group of nerve cells. This process is called long-term potentiation. And long-term potentiation is a biological process involving physical changes that strengthen the synapse in a group of nerve cells, which is believed to be the neural basis of learning. So when we talk about like trying to condense information into our memory, we have a little bit of long-term potentiation that takes place. In operant conditioning, the brain's reward circuitry also comes into play, especially parts of the limbic system associated with the brain structures. Eric Kandel and Robert Hawkins in 1992, they had a theory that rested on the discovery that animals with relatively simple nervous systems have a single type of behavioral response. In the more complex brains of mammals, however, neuroscientists found a type of second learning circuitry that apparently facilitates the higher forms of learning, such as memory for events. Simple circuits seem to be responsible for a sort of mindless learning. That occurs when a dog drools at the sound of a bell, or maybe sometimes riding a bike or swinging a golf club. Higher cognitive learning. Abstract ideas that involve building mental images, assimilating concepts, and pondering ways that they can be related and compared and contrasted. It is not that behavioral conditioning isn't involved in human learning, but the principles of behavioral learning don't tell us the whole story of higher cognitive learning. In cognition, we must make inferences about the process that we cannot measure directly, and cognitive learning is always about the processes that are one step removed from observable behavior. Thank you so much.